One of the earliest research questions on Micronesian suicide was whether suicide rates were really increasing. This was an important early question because before the 1980s, we really had no idea what the suicide rates were because there were no official statistics on suicide being compiled. The first real recorded attempt to answer this question was by Francis Hazel. In his publication on suicide in 1976, titled Micronesia's Hanging Spree, Hazel noted what appeared to be a sudden increase in Trukese youth suicide. Though a crude first attempt to look into suicide in Micronesia, his article gathered much outside attention on Micronesian suicide. However, for many members of the Trukese community, they did not really regard suicide as a major cause of alarm, because they contended, like many neighboring Pacific societies, that suicide has always been a part of their society, a manifestation of an old cultural trait. This was a reasonable view because there are oral traditions of suicide throughout all of Micronesia. According to Hazel, one could find, quote, tales of sweethearts, promised by obdurate parents to others in marriage, leaping hand in hand from spectacular heights, of old men, broken in health and spirit, paddling away in canoes never to be seen again, of shamed young men, jumping from coconut trees before the eyes of their families. Hazel's search into the archives further supports the notion that suicide has always been around in Micronesia. He finds old Protestant missionary and Catholic priest reports that recorded multiple instances of suicide throughout Micronesia. For instance, one report dating back to 1899 showed that at a missionary boarding school in Moen, now called Bueno, there were 6 hangings within a period of 2 years, 4 unsuccessful and 2 successful. The school directress even found it necessary to train a group of young boys to cut down victims in future emergencies. As of this point, the answer to the question on whether Micronesian suicides were increasing was inconclusive. What Hazel needed was a more systematic study to gather more and better data. At the time that Hazel's first article appeared, a cultural anthropologist named Donald Rubinstein was doing field research on the small coral island of Feis in Yap State. 2 years later, Rubinstein partnered with Hazel to plan the first systematic study of suicide in Micronesia. With this study, they will be able to finally gather answers, like finding out whether Micronesian suicides were really increasing as Hazel suggested, or as others have suggested, suicides in Micronesia have always been high and a big part of society, perhaps a manifestation of an old cultural trait, a cultural way of resolving conflict. Hazel and Rubinstein conducted an epidemiological survey. They collected all the available official statistics from hospital records and court certificates of deaths throughout Micronesia from 1979 to 1981. From these death certificates, they followed up by interviewing the friends and family members of the suicide victims, following the guidelines of psychological autopsies to get information on victims' quote, family background, education, work history, health, use of alcohol or drugs, mental problems, and the events leading up to the person's suicide. and how the suicide actually occurred. The amounts of friends and family members of the victims of suicide they interviewed numbered in the hundreds. What Hazel and Rubinstein found through their research definitely confirms the fact that suicide has increased from the early 1960s to the early 1980s. Suicides were doubling every decade from the 1960s to the 1970s and the 1970s to the 1980s, with the most dramatic increase in suicide during the 70s. It was not until the early 80s that suicides began to show signs of decline. However, that was to be short-lived because suicides made a comeback in the mid-80s, showing no signs of decreasing. Hazel and Rubinstein's research not only provided the answer to whether suicide rates were increasing in Micronesia, but also provided answers to other important questions on Micronesian suicide.